Hi, I'm Carl Schultz, Executive Chairman of the Higher Ground Foundation.
And hello from me, Paul Forte. My background is in systems analysis and planning, with extensive experience in the field of healthcare. How climate change adaptation projects can be made sustainable in the long term is the central theme of our presentation. Of course, there are very many challenges on that topic which could be addressed, but we're going to focus more particularly here on the role of metrics. And specifically, we will be referring to the Higher Ground Foundation's development of an instrument and framework which can support long-term perspectives and help overcome motivational barriers to sustaining climate adaptation regimes. So what might we consider to be common aspects of such challenges? Well, overarching clearly is establishment and maintenance of practices that reduce climate vulnerability. But particularly, what actually happens when the diggers and the bulldozers leave, or the outside support and expertise has packed its bags? Is there the strength and the resilience to maintain what's been left behind in the project for the longer term? Key in all of this, of course, is the community ownership and engagement to avoid maladaptive practice. So let's look at some of the motivational barriers to sustaining adaptation. Within communities, a key one is that there may not be any knowledge about future impacts arising from climate change. They may be completely novel and unknown previously to the community. Then new practices which are being suggested or proposed may not be fully understood or fully accepted by the community. And then there's always the prospect that there may be upfront effort and or additional costs associated with these adaptation changes. Climate change is not linear in the sense that there may be potentially many years with no perceivable impact on the ground. And that makes it even more difficult to recognise changes may need to be done in anticipation. And projects themselves, where there's external adaptation support, it's not always designed to address the motivational barriers. And in fact, if it hasn't properly addressed some of these, it can sometimes exacerbate them. We consider that there are 4 key variables in the equation for sustaining adaptation. The first of these is agents, and by that we mean local communities and individuals within those communities, as well as organisational, such as public, government, local and national government, private sector companies, and third sector NGOs. The second variable we look at here is resources in the widest possible sense. So we're including finance, we're including physical assets, and also human resources in terms of skills and competencies. The third one is time horizons. And here the issues are to do with the emphasis that there tends to be on short-termism rather than looking over very long time scales of projects. And also a lack of ability to use the future for scenario planning, whereby we might be looking at a range of different potential possible futures and playing back to the present day to work out what changes we might want to make now, which might make these sorts of scenarios that we want to look at viable in the future. Finally, and perhaps even fundamentally, is the issue around metrics. In other words, the data, the analytics and the skills. It's not just about measuring and monitoring what's going on, but actually about understanding through modelling, through projecting, through synthesising across all of those other variables we've just mentioned to understand how we might shape and understand how the projects work and how they will actually be implemented and maintained over the long term. So metrics are actually very fundamental to the success of sustaining adaptation. So digging a little deeper into the potential role of metrics in addressing sustainability challenges, while of course it's very good to have robust and transparent and comparable metrics, These are necessary, but they're not by themselves quite sufficient to enable completely sustainable adaptation. The other variables we talked about are very important in that as well. But we think adaptation metrics particularly should be very much focused on output and/or outcome orientated views and perspectives. They need to be able to consider long-term climate impacts, not just the next 2, 3, 5 years. And they need to enable comparison of results across different sectors. That's really important. And we think a standard framework approach can support this by enabling pathways approaches, which will hopefully avoid maladaptation. And in doing so, establish a confidence through transparency in setting standards, monitoring outcomes, and also by promoting community participation and ensuring their interests.
Now that Paul has outlined the relevance of metrics to sustainable adaptation and given views on how this can be undertaken effectively, I'd like to outline how the Higher Ground Foundation wants to contribute to this effort. Higher Ground Foundation created an instrument called the VRC, or Climate Vulnerability Reduction Credit, and we developed an associated standard framework for its implementation. The VRC supports a whole system approach to addressing climate change impacts that focuses explicitly on reducing the vulnerability to climate change. It enables a direct comparison of potential adaptation benefits across different types of projects, across different sectors, and across different communities. It's calculated using avoided impact costs in the per capita income of the community where it's being undertaken. We don't have time in this presentation to get into the details of it, but I would urge you, if you're interested, to go to the Higher Ground Foundation's website, where we have lots of information on how this is calculated. The fundamental value added that VRCs give is in establishing trust. VRCs enable confidence in sustained delivery of vulnerability reduction, and as a result, this overcomes a lot of the barriers that we've discussed regarding the motivation for people to undertake adaptations and make changes, because the project's benefits for all are really much more clearly understood and accountable and follow a standard framework so we all understand what's going on. Now that we've established that motivation is a real key element in making adaptation sustainable and that appropriate metrics are critical for sustaining adaptation, I'd like to help unpack some of the specific challenges and how the VRC metric and framework can help to ensure sustainability. We've identified 6 that I'd like to go into some detail on. As Paul mentioned, we feel that adaptation metrics should endeavor to be output or outcome oriented as opposed to input oriented. Unfortunately, the Paris Agreement's only quantitative goal for adaptation is money spent, which doesn't always reflect project effectiveness. VRCs, on the other hand, focus on awarding projects over time through monitored proof of results. So they're much more oriented towards the outputs through monitored results that lead to outcomes that we've tangibly analyzed. It's also important that we really think long-term, since adaptation is a process that's going to be going on for centuries, and the most serious impacts are going to be in the future for most situations. And so a challenge is short-termism, and unfortunately both the public and the private sector, for different reasons, usually has a very short time scale when they're looking at projects in the adaptation space. They're not generally looking over an actual project's lifetime, but they may be looking over a year or 2 or 3, and then a project may end. Now, that isn't very helpful if the asset, the infrastructure, the practice needs to be sustained for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, generations. So what we do need to do is really think about the long term. And how do we do this? Well, VRC registered projects incentivize in the long term because you have to take a view for generally 10 years. And then if you want to get additional credits, you have to reapply with a new baseline. And you don't get upfront, resourcing, and you don't look at what a project's going to look like just after 3 years and then forget about it. You have to really, in order for you to benefit, you have to be thinking long term. A third issue is how are costs and benefits allocated in any sort of agreement? This is really critical because if you're looking at adaptation, there's generally both a public sector and a private sector interest. And of course, the private sector is primarily interested in profit and it has a fiduciary responsibility. And so it's a financial aspect that's critical for the private sector. The public sector, on the other hand, is seeking to do a duty of care for its voters, its community. And as such, it will value things in addition to finance, such as health, safety, aesthetics, good quality of life, education, that aren't fully represented in financial benefits. So we really need to have a more nuanced understanding of both the interests and be able to quantify the benefits according to the different parties. VRCs can help to do this because the VRC can integrate with financial and non-monetized, like using contingent valuation approaches, avoided impacts. So it can help to unpack and help to understand in a more holistic way what the benefits are of a particular project. Besides the barrier of short-termism, a lot of adaptation projects also, unfortunately and ironically, don't sufficiently focus on the future. A lot of them really look at current climate stresses and don't look at downscale climate model projections over, well, what's the climate going to be like in 20, 30, 40 years? And of course, that's problematic because if you don't have that view, it's difficult to really adapt appropriately. So we really need to have a robust approach to explore what those future climate impacts are. And I know it's not easy, but what VRCs do is they include a requirement to analyze future impacts and avoided impacts of adaptation. And that's sort of critical to the VRC and how it's awarded. The fifth challenge I'd like to highlight is what I call problem of metrics to sell not being really the same as metrics to tell. And what do I mean by that? Well, funding frequently really depends, or future funding depends heavily on a narrative of an organization's past successes. Metrics, in the way they're currently organized, oftentimes allow for a lot of vague potential perspectives on how a project achieved its goals that sometimes don't really reflect the realized adaptation outcomes in a community. For instance, you could be looking at a metric like the number of people who are made climate resilient. Well, what does that mean? What we need really is a standard, transparent approach to avoid these sort of vague interpretations of adaptation outcomes. And the VRC standard framework does specify specific measurement indicators in a systematic way that really doesn't allow for a particular type of project to use whatever metric might sound good. As a consequence, we're looking at appropriate approaches to understanding if a project's delivering results, and that, of course, is very good for future projects as it encourages successful, results-oriented activities to be resources as opposed to ones that deploy metrics that maybe don't convey the community's vulnerability reduction. Finally, I think a critical challenge is trying to understand the incentives that an agent, one who needs to adapt, really require for them to sustainably adapt. We don't really know, for instance, what sort of rewards, whether they be money or awards or in-kind material or training. We don't know how much, what price, and to whom these awards should necessarily accrue, and for how long you need to provide some sort of external incentive to allow for an adaptation to really be internalized and just be accepted as something that you just do. So what we really need to do is change that culture of investments and practices by identifying, well, how much is necessary of what, to whom, for how long, and VRC instruments can be used as a way to explore in a transparent manner, coherent manner across a wide variety of different contexts and parameters and rewards what sort of incentives are necessary. And so that can be a critical way for us to go forward and to neither under-reward or over-reward to the point where projects become sustainable. I hope that this was helpful at understanding both the perspective on how metrics can contribute to sustainable adaptation, that we've identified some ways that we need to overcome this, and also how VRCs can contribute to this. I'd like to now back up and talk a little bit about my organization, the Higher Ground Foundation, and how we really fit in. The Higher Ground Foundation is a team of people who are passionate about adaptation and making sure that we do create a future where the best responses to climate change, especially adaptation, are the choices that the world wants to make. And as I think we've outlined, when it comes to sustainable adaptation, there are a lot of challenges, but that there's a potential, and metrics are an important approach, and the VRC is our contribution to how we can help to make the incentives, the motivations align with what we really need to do. So that's why the Higher Ground Foundation is around. So we're here to try to support sustainability. And you can go to our website to learn a lot more about our activities and the work that we've undertaken and how we're organized and how we can support methodology development, how we register projects, requirements for monitoring, all of that stuff. We're right now in what we call our pilot implementation and partnerships phase, or PIP. And this was started at COP23 when we also launched our VRC standard framework after we had gone through an expert's review of the standard framework. During this phase, we're really focused on partnering with relevant people and institutions across all of the different actors that need to be involved, and also piloting VRC approaches for different types of projects in different sectors so that we build up the skill base for the VRC standard framework. And so we want to work with those of you who may have projects or are interested in supporting sustainable adaptation. So I hope you found our presentation interesting, useful, informative, and that you're interested in potentially partnering with us, or at least talking about what we might be able to do together. If you are interested, reach out to us at the contact details below, and I'd like to thank you for your attention and just pass this over to Paul.
And I would also like to add my thanks for your attention and interest, and I hope that you found the presentation both relevant and stimulating.